This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Hey, this is Andy Mills, and you are listening to Reflector. We're back today with our second episode in how the LGBTQ plus coalition came together and why it might be falling apart. In the first episode, we unpacked how gay rights became LGBT rights. And for today, we are back with Ben Kawaller, who's going to tell us how things got even more complicated, both for the coalition and society, with the addition of the Qs.
All right, so should I just start talking?
Yeah, just fire away.
Okay, so let's start this chapter around 2016.
Okay.
So this is a time when the LGBT movement really had the wind at its back. Both of these two camps, the gays and the trans, had scored recent victories.
Sunday marks 1 year since the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in the United States.
Gays won gay marriage in 2015. Trans people had gotten the medical establishment to change the DSM. Also in the culture, there was just more trans visibility than there ever had been.
Bruce Jenner says he considers himself a woman.
Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner.
Yes, for all intents and purposes, I am a woman.
Right, and was really celebrated for it.
And was celebrated for it.
A standing ovation tonight for Caitlyn Jenner.
Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine. That wonderful show, Transparent.
I have to tell him.
No.
Yes.
Allie's crazy.
Debuted on Amazon in 2014.
Tell me what? You're scaring the shit out of me right now.
I love you very much. Dad is a woman. Thinks he is a woman. Wants to be a woman. Something like that.
Do you know what trans is? It's not funny, Josh.
Transparent really is like one of the best written TV shows like ever.
Can I get another Bloody Mary?
Me too. Me too.
Anyway, kind of like we saw with the gays, via pop culture, Americans got to know trans people, trans characters anyway, and see them as human beings as opposed to just stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
However, there were growing tensions inside this now maybe 15 or 20-year-old coalition called LGBT. There were disagreements about goals, priorities, and tactics. And there were even some bedrock ideological differences, including a lack of agreement on what it even meant to be transgender. And I didn't appreciate how complicated this is until I started interviewing all these people. But for some people, especially those who used to go by transsexual, let's roughly call this the old school.
Well, yes, that's the
People like Dana Beyer, for them, being transgender is like a medical condition.
And you shouldn't treat transsexual people any differently than you treat anybody else with any other medical condition.
And these folks will tell you they feel like there's something innately and intrinsically different about them.
This is the lingua franca of the time, born in the wrong body.
Like a female brain within a male body, or vice versa.
That's something that I remember hearing a lot about when I was growing up and first encountering the idea of trans people. It was often explained as someone who had a female brain but a male body, and that incongruence is what they wanted to rectify through medical interventions.
Yeah, and what we call transitioning from one gender to another is how they treat that condition.
Because if your brain sex is one thing and your genital sex is another, then you got to do something about it.
However, there's another group of trans people who strongly disagree.
Most of us grow up in a world where our gender possibilities are shut down from the moment we're children. I want to live in a world where gender is this playful thing, where there's no patriarchy, no misogyny. I want it to feel like a dress-up bin.
And although a lot of these guys have been around for quite some time, let's call this way of thinking the new school.
Okay.
The new school believes there's a whole panoply of ways to experience your gender identity. There's certainly more than male or female.
I am trigender, which means like a triangle, I have 3 genders.
There are different levels of disconnection between your body and your inner identity. A person might feel like a man one day, a woman the next, or something in between. So, like, for instance, you know that guy Jonathan Van Ness?
Once a Blue Devil cheerleader, always a Blue Devil cheerleader. Back in the day, I was one of the first male cheerleaders in Quincy's history.
You ready? Yeah, I'm so excited for this.
From Queer Eye, I think they call it Queer Eye now, Queer Eye for whatever. So he's a good example of this. I mean, I think he actually identifies as non-binary, but he kind of embodies this new transness.
I really love the outfit.
You
That's
do?
really nice. Yeah.
I mean, he'll wear a dress, but he's got a beard. So, for the old school, transness meant wanting to take steps or having taken steps to align your body with your sense of gender. But for the new school, the only unifying quality of being trans is to identify as trans.
If you identify with a different gender other than the one you were born with, you are trans. Non-binary, gender fluid, all that falls under the trans umbrella. You don't have to be on medications. You don't have to have surgeries to be trans. That is just who you are.
So it's almost more metaphysical than it is medical, or more elastic and fluid than something that's fixed. And it's largely, you're saying, just like based on your inner sense of yourself.
Exactly. If you say you're trans, you're trans.
For me, transgender means transgressively gendered.
Here's how trans author and playwright Kate Bornstein put it back in 1996.
That can be anything from having feelings that, well, this gender I'm in right now isn't right. It can mean something like, well, I'm a woman, but I don't want to be, barefoot and pregnant in my husband's kitchen all the time. It can even mean a woman who loves women, a man who loves men. Transgender is just a big old umbrella term that includes just about everyone I know.
And just as a disclaimer, I'm talking in pretty broad strokes here. I mean, obviously not everyone who identifies as trans falls neatly into one of these two camps, but I'm describing two very different understandings of what transness can mean. And what's important to grasp is that this newer understanding is rooted in a school of thought called queer theory.
And I know that this is potentially opening a can of worms here, but how would you briefly summarize what is queer theory?
Well, I could try to do that, Andy, but I asked Claude instead. I think I'm going to let AI take this one.
Thank you, LLMs.
Yeah. Okay. Queer theory is an academic approach that questions and challenges the idea that categories like gender and sexuality are fixed, natural, or binary. Instead, it sees them as socially constructed, meaning they're created and maintained by culture, power structures, and social norms, rather than being inherent biological facts.
As queer people, we're moving through the social fabric in a way that exceeds the categories that are available, that disrupts, norms, heteronorms, that has a different imaginary of what the future should be like.
This is Susan Stryker.
Dr. Susan Stryker, PhD. I'm a historian. I'm a retired professor of gender studies from the University of Arizona.
She's been called one of the founders of this school of thought. And for Susan,
there are these deeply internalized ways that we understand men and women in the world.
And biological sex is just one of them. One way to categorize people. It's a popular way, but it's not the only way. And so queer theory writ large is really about
finding a way to really imagine and experience how different things can be, how much of what we accept as nature is actually history.
All right, so in other words, according to queer theory, the sex binary itself, the very idea that there are two distinct categories called male and female, that is a product of culture. So there's no sort of reason inherent to humanity that we should think of men and women as two distinct camps. And if we wanted to, we could, and most queer theorists would probably argue that we should, find a new way to categorize folks. Or maybe not even categorize folks at all.
Wow. So for the new school, as you're calling them, queer theory side of this debate, this is not just a civil rights fight saying you should treat men and women equally, whether they are, gay or straight or trans. They're trying to challenge at the very foundational level what it means for us to organize ourselves as men and women at all.
Yes, it's about deeper kinds of questions than just, minority rights.
It's about how these categories of male and female are themselves oppressive, and that there's no total freedom as long as those categories persist.
Wow. So in some ways, just like how there was new tensions brought in when the T's joined up in the coalition, the Q's are bringing tensions all their own.
Yeah. Now, to be clear, this has been a tension going back years. I mean, within the trans community, people were arguing over this stuff in the 90s. But what predominated in the national consciousness was the old school.
Mm-hmm.
However, as trans visibility was coming into pop culture in the 2010s, you saw these newer identities, non-binary, genderqueer, transmasculine, transfeminine, a kind of nouveau transness that was emerging. And with that came a growing hostility between the old school trans and the new school trans.
What's going on today, what people call trans today, that has nothing to do with trans as we've known it for the previous 100 years.
Simply put, the old guard feels that the new guard is co-opting their identities, that people are calling themselves trans without actually experiencing gender dysphoria.
The queer community appropriated the word trans, gender identity, gender dysphoria, and such.
And that they're using this identity politically.
To their advantage. I mean, I guess we opened that door up, and I'm partially responsible for that, because we didn't want to make it too exclusive.
And then the other side, the new school.
Trans medicalists believe in the pathologization of transgender existence.
Feels like the old school is equating transness with having a mental illness.
Trans medicalism is a belief that is, at its core, exclusionary and harmful.
It facilitates abuse, mistreatment, and misperceptions of transgender people.
And they feel like they're being exclusionary. They call them medicalists.
If you have been the target of trans medicalism or anything like that, I'm so sorry. I love you. You are valid. You are, perfect.
But this philosophical difference, it wasn't contained to just inside the trans community. It started to spill out into the larger LGBTQ coalition as well.
It's often cisgender gays and lesbians who are biggest detractors, who say, oh, yes, we want marriage equality, but that's too much.
Because think about it. If being a man or being a woman has no physical meaning, that poses a problem for the idea of homosexuality. I mean, the majority of gay men and women identify as such because they're attracted to individuals of the same biological sex. But if biological sex is a construct, or if biological sex is irrelevant to gender identity and what really matters is gender identity, that's going to lead to some internal fights.
Mm-hmm. I remember the first time that I encountered this tension, I think it was probably 2018, 2019 maybe, and there was this conflict emerging between who you're calling the new school, trans women in this case, and a group of lesbians. And the lesbians were saying that they did not want to date or have sexual relationships with trans women who had penises or beards or things, that we think of as male. And the new school trans people were calling them transphobic and bigoted because they were saying it shouldn't matter what anatomy they have, right? If they identify as a woman, they are a woman. And if you are a lesbian, you should be willing to have a romantic relationship with them.
Yeah.
But then the lesbians were on the other side saying, no, I'm not attracted to the construct of a woman. I'm attracted to women, the whole package.
Right.
And it was leading to this really intense back and forth that I'd never really considered before.
And this hasn't just happened with lesbians. Ditto for gay men and vaginas.
Yeah, and Ben, how does this end up changing the broader movement? It feels like this is bound to change what it is the coalition is fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, this started as a movement about sexual freedom, a fight for the government to treat homosexuals and heterosexuals equally. And the new LGBT movement was looking increasingly like...
I see all of it as part of a broader project.
A project to fundamentally transform society's understanding of gender and sexuality.
Changing the way society understands what gender means.
We have to politicize what they call natural and naturalize what they call political.
Oh, this is interesting because it's like an escalation and a change from what we were talking about last week. On the one hand, with same-sex marriage, there was an attempt to redefine marriage, not just as between a man and a woman, but as between, two citizens. And in some ways, that was a fairness, equality, civil rights argument that was being made. That the same way that a man and a woman who fall in love have the freedom to marry, men and men, women and women, they should have the freedom when they fall in love to get married. But now they're not just looking to redefine marriage, so to speak, but to redefine truly one of the most foundational ways that people understand themselves. And now they're going to try and convince, I suppose, the broader public to redefine how they see both sex and gender. Is that right?
Well, Andy, it is interesting that you're using the word convince because along with the changes in the ideology came changes in tactics.
On that tease, we're going to go to a short break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey guys, this is Matt, co-founder here at Longview, where we believe in reporting that is worthy of your trust, grounded in curiosity and not political bias. And this original reporting is kind of expensive. So to pay for that, you are about to hear some ads. However, we are also listener supported. And if you would like to go ad-free and support our independent reporting at any dollar amount that you would like, you can do that by clicking on the link in our show notes or by going to longviewinvestigations.com. Until then, here's a brief message from our sponsors. Thanks.
As a chef, I know flavor doesn't begin in the kitchen. It begins on the land. And Westhome's nature-led Australian Wagyu is a story written in the landscape of Northern Australia. Cooking is storytelling, and Westhome Wagyu carries a story of Northern Australia itself, raw, powerful, and deeply authentic. It's a testament to the passion and care raised in the rhythm of Northern Australia. I'm Chef Maylin from 88 Club in Los Angeles, and I invite you to visit westhome.com/Maylin to learn more and taste a story only Westhome nature-led Australian Wagyu can tell. That's westholme.com/MEILIN.
Are you stuck staring at your W-2? Are tax refund worries holding you back? You probably have FOMO, the fear of messing up. The fix? Using TurboTax on Intuit Credit Karma. They find every credit and deduction to help you get every refund dollar you deserve, or your money back. It's time to overcome your fear of messing up and get your taxes done right. Start filing today in the Credit Karma app.
So if you're just joining us, we're talking about how the gay rights movement went from we're here, we're queer, to we're here, you're queer.
Oh, Ben, you're funny.
So let's talk about Herndon Graddick. This is an interesting guy.
My name is Herndon Graddick. I don't know that I have a title per se right now, but
he joined GLAAD in 2010, I believe. He was the VP of Programs and Communication. And in 2012, he was elected president of the organization.
Oh, so he was the president of GLAAD right as, queer and trans visibility is more public and right before the win for marriage equality.
Yeah, and during that time, he was really focused on how GLAAD was responding to people in the public eye who did something homophobic, say. So as part of that work, he began a bunch of programs to draw attention to speech or conduct that GLAAD considered anti-LGBT.
Yeah, it was just about really educating reporters and journalists and other people who had voices in the media. I mean, what we were doing was taking what someone said, blast it out through our social media channels, and just educating them and including it in a database online.
For instance, like the film director Brett Ratner, someone asked him once about his rehearsal process for when he's directing films, and he said,
Rehearsal? What's that?
Rehearsals for fags. Meaning, rehearsals for wimps or, y'all know what fags are. Wimps or sissies.
Public uproar over the filmmaker's reported use last week of an anti-gay slur.
And then, he was in the middle of this PR nightmare.
So what is GLAAD's response to all this? Like under Herndon's leadership, what do they do in a situation like this?
Herndon told me that,
you sort of just try to figure out a way to heal, not throw people off your side permanently, but kind of figure out a path forward that you wind up being friends.
GLAAD's approach was to encourage people who had transgressed to make some sort of amends. And so instead of just labeling this guy a homophobe and trying to get him cast out of the entertainment industry,
Brett Ratner I met with, and, he's really an ally who said something bad.
And then, later that year in a crowd of hundreds, they gave Ratner an award, honored him at the Media Awards.
I learned a valuable lesson. A word can matter, whether it's said with malice or as a joke.
There was a similar situation with Tracy Morgan, saying that if he had a gay kid, he'd stab him.
He ended up apologizing. We went and did something at that same location with him.
Right, this is what the people today would call the calling in method, right?
Right. Now, I did do some reporting on this specific Brett Ratner saga, and it turns out that, GLAAD also got Ratner to make some free videos for the organization. So, make of that what you will. We give you an award, help you put your reputation back in place. You give us some free labor.
Right, a little quid pro quo going on here.
That's right. Nothing's pure in this world, Andy.
Nothing.
But here's the thing. So GLAAD's Commentator Accountability Project, it wasn't really focused on celebrities as much as like popular conservatives and religious opponents to gay rights. People like President of the Family Research Council, Tony Perkins.
They're looking for acceptance. There's an emptiness within them, and they're looking for that acceptance. And they think that if society will redefine the norms of behavior, that will make them feel content. And it won't, because they're operating outside of nature, outside of God's plan and design.
I mean, this is someone who is very prominent in the fight against gay marriage. GLAAD put him on this list to not only condemn his statements, but to tell the media that if you're going to have this guy on, you should know this is where he stands on these things. He's not like a neutral observer.
I'm not going to be silent while they try to redefine marriage in this country, change policy, what my children are taught in schools, and what religious organizations can do. I'm not going to be silent.
But just as sort of a marker of how different things were then than they are now, even Tony Perkins, despite how committed this guy was to his view,
we'd be delighted to welcome him into our home and to have him spend time with me and my spouse and our...
There were still prominent gay rights activists, like the head of the Family Equality Council.
I don't think that I'll change his mind, but I do think we might be able to open his heart a little bit. And
who are willing to have this guy in their home.
My experience is that when our families actually spend time with people who may not know us, who haven't had a chance to meet us, they actually do soften their hearts.
However, in the 2010s, this strategy really began to change. And part of that change happened at GLAAD. In 2014, they get this new president who's still serving now. Her name's Sarah Kate Ellis. And under Sarah Kate Ellis, GLAAD embraced a very different ethos.
I was in a room of computers with maybe 7 other interns or something, compiling Google Docs of material.
And what does that change look like?
Well, I spoke to my friend Ben Appel. He interned at GLAAD in 2017. He worked on what they call the News and Rapid Response Team.
And when I landed that gig, I was so psyched because I was like, this is exactly where I want to be. This is amazing.
And basically, his job was to comb the internet looking for offenses committed by people that GLAAD deemed homophobic or transphobic.
So in a way, building off of what GLAAD was doing during Herndon's era.
In a way, but as he described to me, the threshold for offensiveness had become a lot lower than it had been.
Like Roseanne Barr.
So for context, Roseanne Barr, she had the #1 show in the country in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And she had the first lesbian kiss on television in 1994, 93.
Mm-hmm.
In 1999, GLAAD honored her with an award for her depictions of LGBT characters. This was someone who was very much an ally to the gay and lesbian movement. By 2018, though, and this was following a controversy about a transgender woman who'd used a women's locker room at Evergreen State College, Barr wrote on Twitter, quote, "I'm sorry, but a dick means you are a man to me. Maybe I'm old and out of it, but I can't go there. Sorry." And
I could already tell this isn't going to go well for Roseanne.
And she stated, "Women do not want your penises forced in their faces or in our private bathrooms. Respect that fact."
That's a good Roseanne Barr.
Thank you.
And so they were like, she has this new show coming out, The Conners. We're going to call for a boycott of it, like collect all of the problematic things that she's tweeted and said, put that in a doc. And I was just like, yeah, I'm a part of this. I'm going to do it. Like, super psyched.
So I should note that the Roseanne story was a little bit more complicated here as well. So in fact, ABC had asked GLAAD to look into Roseanne's online statements because they had an episode coming up about gender nonconformity, and they wanted to see if there was anything potentially embarrassing there.
So this was a little bit of homophobia insurance, so to speak.
Right. Roseanne did at one point use the word tranny to refer to Michelle Obama. So, not great. But what Ben remembers is that
when I'm gathering all of these things, like her tweets, I couldn't find anything that was like transphobic. I couldn't find anything.
Her concerns about women's rights to same-sex spaces were being misrepresented, or he was being encouraged to misrepresent these statements as hateful and bigoted.
I'm thinking to myself, well, it seems like she has a valid concern in a way. Like, it doesn't seem like she just like hates all trans people, but she's just like, there's going to be some nefarious men that will try to take advantage of this and perhaps harm women in their private spaces.
All right, now we'll get into this more in a minute, but part of this locker room controversy was coming from this change initiated by the Qs. Again, the old school Ts were concerned with passing, with getting surgeries, taking hormones, trying to live as women.
Mm-hmm.
For the new school, there's nothing about having a penis or a beard that might preclude one from being a woman.
The idea that I'd have to be accepted as a woman, I'd have to surrender my body to medical science to make it conform to, it's sort of offensive, really.
And for Ben, the idea that these statements from Roseanne, this person who'd always been an ally to gays and lesbians, would qualify her in GLAAD's mind as an anti-LGBTQ bigot, that just felt wrong.
And I was like, at the very least, even if you disagree, even if she's way off, even if this is a cystic show, even if blah, 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 however you feel about it, isn't the way to have a conversation?
But inside GLAAD, the answer had increasingly become no. So by the end of the 2010s, the approach has changed. It's not about having some public reconciliation. It's about condemnation. It's about saying that you are outside the bounds of acceptable discourse.
And I saw that consistently, that it was very much about that approach to activism.
And look, maybe it's hard for people to sympathize with Roseanne Barr these days, but in this era, GLAAD's accountability project list grew massively. It wasn't just about the Tony Perkinses of the world. It now included reporters, people like Jesse Singal or Helen Lewis from The Atlantic. And they weren't on there for bigoted comments. It's for slightly heterodox opinions or for factual reporting that they didn't like. And so they labeled misinformation. To be clear, GLAAD was hardly alone when it came to embracing a fairly punishing ethos. In many ways, they were of a piece with the cultural trends of the late 2010s and 2020s.
Yeah, this was all happening alongside the rise of, online shaming.
We live at a time now where we have what we call cancel culture,
where a number of prominent people, sometimes private people, found themselves in the eye of an online storm.
If you do something wrong, you're supposed to be out of here. And it could have been 5 minutes ago, or it could have been 20, 30 years ago.
And what it does is it makes examples out of certain people so that everybody watching now knows that you're not going near, not just that person, but that type of behavior.
And many of them, suffered career and personal consequences because of it.
Anyone in particular come to mind, Andy?
Some people I know. But continue, Ben.
Yeah, but it's during this time, this strategy among this coalition flips from let's see if we can make an ally to let's condemn and expel.
Right.
And this gets more and more intense and will even come to ensnare some people who were prominent LGBT allies or prominent LGBT people themselves.
An open letter published in Harper's Magazine this week condemning cancel culture as an attack.
You may remember that in June of 2020, 100-some-odd writers signed what became known as the Harper's Letter, which more or less called for us to treat people with differing opinions with more tolerance and grace on the internet.
The statement warns that, quote, the free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted.
Right. This was in some ways a response to how punishing social media had gotten and how it was having a chilling effect.
Right.
It was a request for us all to be slightly less like assholes online.
And it was signed by people from across the political spectrum, including
Jennifer Finney Boylan, also known as Jenny.
Jenny Finney Boylan.
I'm an author of 19 books.
Jenny is one of the most prominent trans writers in America. At the time, she was an op-ed contributor at the New York Times. And the problem is...
Well, I signed it, but they didn't tell me who the other signatories were, one of whom was J.K. Rowling.
Andy, you may be familiar with the tension between Ms. Rowling and the trans activist community.
More familiar than any person ever need be, yes.
Okay, well, the brief story here, and I assume you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that Rowling's been persona non grata for a lot of trans people ever since declaring her support for a UK woman who was fired from her job over her belief that biological sex should be used to define what it means to be a woman.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good summary. And I mean, I think it's worth pointing out, too, that Rowling had been a longtime ally of the LGBT movement. She was celebrated by groups like GLAAD and other gay rights organizations. And to this day, she says that there's nothing wrong with being trans, but she is very vocal about her belief that trans women shouldn't be conflated with women because there are times where their rights might be in conflict and that we have to sort that out. And a few years ago, our team made this big series called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, where we talked to her and her critics, and we basically dove into this subject we're talking about, how hard it is to have these nuanced public debates in our contemporary culture.
Yeah, Rowling wasn't just criticized for her statements. She became, and is still, thought of as this hate figure among some LGBT activists.
I think it's important to say some there because, yet again, this points to some disagreements inside the coalition. There were people who defended her, and there were some people who very loudly not just condemned her, but took things pretty far.
Right. People said she was supporting a trans genocide, that she was a dangerous person. And so when word got around that Jenny Finney Boylan had signed the same letter as J.K. Rowling,
my community just came at me and said, how dare you stand with J.K. Rowling?
That was enough for her to become a target.
What you're saying is that transgender people should just knuckle under to people like J.K. I was getting letter after letter from people who I respected and loved and said, you've broken my heart.
So what did you do?
I finally said something like, the meaning of this letter changes depending on who the signatories are. And though I agree with the idea that we should all be more respectful to each other, I also regret not having the big picture. So this was my fault, and I kind of stood down from it and said the responsibility is mine. It was a chicken shit move.
And she retracted her signature.
I shouldn't have backed down from it. I should have stood my ground. It was a chicken shit move, and I regret disassociating myself from it.
It's not like Jenny was the only trans figure to experience this shift.
That's just the way it was. Nobody argued about it.
Dana Beyer, who was one of the folks who campaigned to get the T's to be part of LGBT, who was part of the campaign to get gender identity disorder renamed gender dysphoria in the DSM. This person who was this instrumental is now no longer welcome in certain parts of this movement.
They tried to get me canceled. They no longer were willing to engage with me. If you can't debate this with me or others like me, you don't have a case. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we're seeing that the tactics have made a clear change. But if we just go back a little bit, after gay marriage passes, what does this LGBTQ coalition fight for? What is the overarching goal of the movement in this new era?
Yeah, it's interesting because, on one hand, the same organizations that were fighting for gay rights issues like marriage equality, they start using their power and influence to fight for the T's. And they're fighting battles that they see as being about fairness, like, for instance, these bathroom bills.
I'm a transgender woman. I was born with a male body, but inside I always knew I was female. So I transitioned, and now I live every day as the woman I've always known myself to be.
In 2016, there are these campaigns to overturn laws that say trans people have to use the bathroom that aligns with their biological sex.
Safety and privacy in bathrooms are important for all of us. I have lived as a woman for many years. Most people, when they stop and think about it, they realize that when businesses can legally force me to use the men's room, it puts me at risk for harassment and violence.
And again, it's pretty successful politically.
North Carolina's controversial law dictating which public restrooms that transgender people must use was repealed today.
And in 2016, even Donald Trump, when he was running for president,
people go, they use the bathroom that they feel is appropriate.
He was anti-bathroom bill.
There has been so little trouble, so I would say that's probably the best.
Do you have any transgender people working in your organization?
I don't know. Probably do. I really don't know.
But when it comes to what the Qs were fighting for, it was a lot less overt. Unlike the bathroom bills, the changes that were introduced by people from the more Q side of things were coming without much debate and often without really any fanfare.
The Obama administration released this unusual administrative vehicle called a Dear Colleague letter through the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education.
So this is Lior Sapir. He's a political scientist from the Manhattan Institute. He's written extensively on how trans activists have turned their ideas into law. And he says that back in 2016...
And that Dear Colleague letter instructed all schools that receive federal funding, which is almost all schools in the nation, that as a condition of receiving federal funds, they now have to treat students according to their gender identity rather than their sex assigned at birth.
Which was a quietly huge deal because... first off, 2016 was the first year that the federal government was using language like sex assigned at birth in this way. But more consequentially, under Title IX, schools are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of sex. But now, that was being interpreted to mean that schools could not discriminate on the basis of self-described gender identity. And to make this more complicated...
It didn't really explain what it meant by gender identity. It didn't explain its claim that sex is assigned at birth. It just kind of posited these terms. And the second thing that I found interesting was that it said, the Office for Civil Rights said, this is nothing new. This is what Title IX has always required schools to do. And this is what courts have always said that schools have to do.
This became a part of a really meaningful shift. First on college campuses, it meant that entry into women's-only spaces or participation on a women's sports team could be guaranteed as a matter of federal law and could largely be determined now by someone's self-proclaimed gender identity.
Right, not their sex.
Right. And this shift spreads throughout more and more of American institutions and law, where gender non-conforming identities, not just trans, but non-binary, genderqueer, etc., they can now point to precedents of sex-based discrimination cases and say...
That whole body of law applies to us too, and it applies specifically in that it requires the courts to replace sex with gender identity.
These changes start showing up in state law. In New York, lawmakers passed something called the Gender Recognition Act. This allowed New Yorkers to officially designate themselves male, female, intersex, non-binary, or undesignated on state-issued documents. And the idea that a person can have a self-designated gender identity starts showing up in regulations as a matter of simple fact.
We have the Gender Identity Toolkit, which is mandatory training in state government.
This is Matthew McMurrow. He is a gay activist who was an advisor to New York Governor Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio. And he says that starting in 2017, there were ideas that were added to city documents and guidelines, from schools to even state employee handbooks.
The Department of Health, Department of Education, anywhere that LGBTQ youth might be involved.
That are very clearly based in queer theory. For example,
now you will watch a video about gender.
So city and state employees have to watch videos like this one.
Everyone has a relationship with gender.
Whether you've thought about gender a little or a lot, it has impacted you.
So when people are born, society defines them by looking at their reproductive organs and labels them male or female.
It's a girl! Well, actually, it's more complicated than that.
Which instruct them on a very particular, kind of Susan Stryker-esque view of gender.
Hi, I'm C.
Hi, I'm Lindsay, and we're non-binary.
For me, that means I don't identify as either a woman or a man.
And for me, that means I don't identify with a gender at all.
But of course, it presents it not just as one way to understand gender, but as the way that they must view gender as a matter of policy.
You understand your identity better than anyone else.
No matter how you identify, you deserve to be believed and respected.
It's not like New York City and state were alone in this. They were part of a broader trend. A version of this happened in California and in other states. And over a few short years, many institutions had essentially flipped out the definitions and protections related to sex or sexual orientation for these kind of Q-inspired notions about gender identity.
And that's not happenstance. That was the product of a deliberate rhetorical strategy, and I think a very successful one.
And again, these changes were not the product of a public discourse, were not a product of debate. These things were instituted in subtler ways. And one of those ways was in pushing for changes in the ways that people speak about gender and sexuality. And in part by changing the definitions of certain words and ideas, literally changing them. One way you can see this is in how GLAAD changed their guidelines. These were guidelines that they issue for members of the media and, for the general public, I guess, for how to write and talk about LGBT issues and people. So I'm gonna read to you from their recommendations, which you can read on their website now, for how to talk about us queers. So first off, GLAAD now recommends avoiding using words like biological male or biological female. They say you should instead refer to people exclusively by their gender identity. And they continue that everyone has a gender identity, which is defined as a person's internal, deeply held knowledge of their own gender.
Right, this is that more metaphysical understanding that almost like a soul, all of us inside has a gender identity, and it's up to us and us alone what that is.
Right. They also say to avoid using words like homosexual. They say this is an outdated clinical term. They went so far as to call it derogatory and offensive. To quote this manual, use gay, lesbian, or when appropriate, bisexual, pansexual, or queer to describe people attracted to people of the same gender or more than one gender. Andy, if I ask you bisexual, what does bisexual mean? What would you say?
I'd say that's when a man or a woman enjoys the romantic company of both men and women.
That's so wonderfully Christian of you. That was so well said.
No,
it's when a gentleman or a lady prefers the company of either sex. Yeah, it's when you're interested in men or women.
Right.
But according to GLAAD, the bi in bisexual refers to genders the same as and different from one's own gender.
So it's not about sex. It's about gender.
It's about gender. It's all gender. And to be clear, we should not write or imply that bi means being attracted to men and women. That is not an accurate definition of the word. I'm reading from the guidelines here. And also, do not use a hyphen in the word bisexual.
I'm glad they threw that in.
God forbid. And just like with this Title IX stuff from the Obama administration, it wasn't like one day GLAAD said, hey, everyone, we've been convinced that queer theory really has it figured out when it comes to how to conceptualize gender, and we want to convince you of that. It was just, this is how it is. And also kind of, this is how it's always been.
Right. There's not an acknowledgement that something is changing, and also not an acknowledgement that these views are still somewhat fringe, not just in public, but even inside of some aspects of the LGBTQ coalition.
Right. It cannot be said that every gay, lesbian, or even transgender person subscribes to this way of thinking about gender, that your gender is simply something that you can assign to yourself. But according to the people I've been talking to, these sorts of changes are being advocated by these really well-funded groups that have built relationships with lawmakers, with educational institutions, and, of course, medical bodies going back to the 80s and 90s. And in short time, they've been able to make a number of significant institutional changes.
Right. Well, I know we don't have time to go over all of them, but what are some key examples of the changes that they're able to bring about?
All right. A few different categories. So, with the media, this is how you get outlets like the Associated Press or NPR changing the language that they use.
Organizations are urging that all pregnant people get the COVID vaccine.
I think maybe the most interesting thing was the advent of pregnant people or birthing people.
The studies show that having money and an education doesn't protect Black birthing parents
and their babies.
Many of them not only adopted the language of queer activists, but I think a lot of gay people may remember this move. There was a revision of the whole history of gay rights.
I think a lot of people forget that Pride was started by trans and gender nonconforming people of color.
Gay rights were now LGBTQ rights, and even history itself was being revised to be more inclusive of queer identities.
The story of Pride begins with the uprising at the Stonewall Inn back in June of 1969. And the LGBTQ community fought back during a police raid. Transgender women of color played a huge role in that pivotal moment. Now, 52 years later, a new generation of transgender trailblazers is making history.
You also had massive corporations that were making these changes in language and definitions, like Google, Disney, Microsoft, Coca-Cola.
There's a Coke for he, and she,
and them.
Macy's department store.
I can be 100% myself and comfortable in my gender expression.
I do connect with my masculine self, but my feminine self is just very natural.
Many of these companies made changes to their employee guidelines and handbooks to replace sex with gender identity, or to add gender identity to a list of protected categories.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them encouraged their employees to do things like display their pronouns in their bios and their email sign-offs.
Hello, everyone. I'm Natalie Gadilla. I'm a Caucasian woman with long blonde hair, and I go by she, her.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Fillingham. I'm a Caucasian man with glasses and a beard. I go by he, him, and I'm a security evangelist here at Microsoft.
They offer health insurance packages giving employees' kids access to what we now call gender-affirming care for minors, which of course brings us to the most consequential change, which is in the medical world.
Using language that insinuates that all individuals identify as either male or female fails to recognize those who may not, which produces opposing cisgender and transgender categories. The nature of sexual and gender identities are multidimensional, and care should be taken to avoid language that does not acknowledge the fluidity of one's sexual orientation and gender.
These organizations had great success in changing medical definitions of things. 73, homosexuality out of the DSM. 2013, gender identity disorder, now gender dysphoria. Well, in the 20-teens and into 2020, there was a really massive shift to replace sex with gender identity in medicine, and to get a lot of queer theory ideas put into official recommendations. So, for example, I have here the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, not the American Psychiatric Association, different.
Thank you.
To quote them, this is from a 2024 document, their policy statement on affirming evidence-based inclusive care for transgender, gender diverse, and non-binary individuals. Their first citation here: whereas gender diversity is present through the lifespan and has been present throughout history. Citation, Susan Stryker.
Look at that.
Yeah, she's right there. And this was of a piece with getting pretty much every single American medical association to support medical interventions for gender nonconforming youth.
Almost all of the top medical associations in the country, American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services all support gender-affirming care.
And look, it's not like GLAAD changing its guidelines happened, and then suddenly everyone's queer and every kid gets a sex change.
Right.
This was happening alongside a whole bunch of other social changes. The rise of the smartphone, for instance, places like Tumblr blowing up with gender discourse, people coming out as trans and queer, and people knowing those people. It's very hard to oppose something done in the name of making an inclusive world for queer people when you know people who identify as queer.
Right. I feel like that one is huge, but also we could go on and on listing all the reasons that this has become a more and more salient issue, right?
Right. But the key thing to take away is that these groups that were set up as gay civil rights groups, many of which came out of the fight against AIDS, in a few short years after marriage equality, they made massive gains in the world of policy, law, medicine, even how people speak. And this all happened really fast.
Well, if you think about, just take a step back and compare it to other civil rights movements, right? So black civil rights, hundreds of years in the making. Women's rights, also hundreds of years. Even gay rights. If you take, let's say, the Stonewall riots and Obergefell as your bookends, you're talking about half a century. And that was half a century of marching through the streets, of launching public, persuasion campaigns, of lobbying, of working through the political parties debating on TV and in the journals and all that kind of stuff, the merits and demerits of same-sex marriage. Here you have a movement that represents a tiny fraction of the population that makes very radical claims about the nature of reality and that managed to achieve incredible success in virtually all social institutions within the span of a few short years with almost no buy-in, debate, approval from the wider public.
But what has happened now, especially since 2020, is this dawning awareness among Americans that a radically new way of thinking about gender and even a new way of thinking about reality has found footing in America's institutions. And because of how quickly these once rather fringe views have become institutionalized, and just because of the pace of this change and how deep into American institutions these changes have been, it has fed a real backlash. And it's a backlash that's not just seeing the rolling back of many of these changes. It's one that might ultimately break up the coalition itself. And I think where that backlash really began was in the American school. And that's what we're going to look at next time.
Reflector is produced by Longview. And if you aren't yet a supporter, you will hear part 3 of this story next week. However, if you'd like to support our original independent reporting and hear that next episode right now, all you have to do is click on the link in our show notes and for whatever dollar amount you want, become a subscriber. You can also visit us at longviewinvestigations.com or leave a comment and sign up for our newsletter at longviewinvestigations.substack.com. Together, we are working to build a new media landscape that is rooted in curiosity, deeper thinking, and more open minds. Thank you, and we'll be back soon.